I've had numerous conversations with people, and if they talk about transgenderism, they'll lower their voice. They'll look around them to see if anybody is listening. It's as if we're in Germany in 1939, and my friend wants to say something a little bit negative about Hitler.
Hello and welcome to the Brendan O'Neill Show with me, Brendan O'Neill. This is a monthly podcast in which an esteemed guest joins me to talk about the big ideas, the bad ideas, the problems and the controversies of the early 21st century. This month, I am delighted to be joined by the novelist Lionel Shriver. Lionel barely needs an introduction. She is the author of numerous novels, including prize-winning novels, and she is a columnist with The Spectator. And she is a literary figure who is also a public figure. Her thoughts on art, politics, and society always make an impact in the public sphere. A reviewer for The Washington Post once said that if Jodi Picoult has her finger on the zeitgeist, Lionel Shriver has her hands around its throat. Over the next hour, I hope we will tighten even harder that grip around the throat of the zeitgeist. Lionel, welcome to the show.
Pleasure to be here.
I want to start by talking about something that you've written about quite a lot, which is the impossibility of art in the era of identity politics, because it strikes me, and I know it strikes you as well, that one of the most tragic accomplishments of the politics of identity has been to create an aura of suspicion and even censorship around art, literature and entertainment. And what it's done, it seems to me, is polluted these things with politics, so that art and literature are less and less judged by their beauty or their meaning or their humanity, but rather by whether they accord with the ideological worldview of the new identitarians. Does this film have enough gay characters? Is it acceptable for this white author to write a story about black people? Should this cis actress play a transgender character? You have written about this cultural correctness, and as you put it, there is now a torrent of do's and don'ts that bind our imaginations and make the process of writing and publishing fearful. So, in your view, where does this kind of new Stalinism come from, and how destructive is it of the artistic endeavor?
Well, I had an interesting conversation with a professional critic recently. She teaches criticism at the New School and more recently at Columbia. And she says that when she's speaking to students, say about 20 years old, it never occurs to them that their job isn't as a critic to assess an author, say, in terms of morality, whether or not this piece of art serves the political purposes that they believe to be good. And I found that shocking. And she says it's almost impossible to dislodge them from this viewpoint of what a critic's job is. And I am starting to see this notion of what a critic's job is emerge in reviews often written by younger people of my own work, so that I'm starting to spot a certain genre of review that whereas the author has often come at one of my books with a preconceived notion of who I am out in the world, what my political opinions are. Often it's a preconceived hostility. And therefore, the book has been read at a great distance. There are different ways of reading. And reading demands a kind of surrender. Even if you come out of that surrender and pull back out and decide, actually, this book has a lot of problems, or maybe I didn't like it. In order to give the book a chance, you have to be submerged within it and give over. And these reviews I'm talking about, those readers refuse to do that. And so when you keep you keep a solid 2 feet between you and the text, and you're just looking at it for for sins.
Yes.
Right? And by the way, you always find them.
Yeah. It's fascinating that you say that you need to surrender to a book, or you need to surrender to art in many ways in order to appreciate it fully. And it's almost as if we've created a culture in which that is actively discouraged. And instead you approach art or literature or film. You have these people who go to watch movies and then they go home and write a Tumblr blog about how many minutes the female characters spoke for in comparison with the male characters. And what you realize is that we've created a new generation who are incapable of appreciating art, which seems to me to be a great loss for them, as well as for the artists or the writers on the receiving end of some of their highly politicized criticisms.
I entirely agree. I think that there's a huge loss on the part of the audience, because that distance I'm describing, it pertains not just to a reader in, say, my books. It is a distance that you're describing in relation to all of art, because there's a clinical remove. That there's a kind of scientific examination of whether or not this thing is meeting prescribed criteria.
I completely agree, and I wonder how new this phenomenon is. I mean, obviously there have been examples in the past, historic examples where political demands have been made of art, and artists and writers have been expected to depict their society or the people in their society in a particular way. And not only in tyrannical regimes, but also in the West itself. I always thought that Ray Bradbury's coda that he wrote for the 1979 edition of Fahrenheit 451 captured very well some of these problems. So he talked about how he continually got letters from people saying, well, you don't have enough of this minority group in your books, or you've depicted this minority group in the wrong way. And his argument in his coda was that there is more than one way to burn a book. And what this kind of pressure, this political pressure does, is it withdraws the artist's independence, and it kind of flattens literature out, or irons it out, so that it all says the right, acceptable, correct thing. And his argument really was, in essence, that when it comes to literature and art, the creator is in many ways the dictator. It's his
entirely,
and his argument was that
that's what makes it so fun.
Yes, and his argument was that you people out there, you have no jurisdiction over the realm of my imagination, and that was a very clear point he made. And one of the things I think is a shame now is that there seem to be very few writers or artists or creators who are willing to stand up to the new moral correctness, or this new pressure that is put on them to write in a particular way or to say certain things.
Which I find dismaying. I don't understand it because the impulse to make stuff, to write books, is one of claiming jurisdiction, as you put it. And it is what makes it fun. No one's the boss of you. Yeah. This is your world. You're in complete control. And I don't understand the impulse to abdicate that world.
Yeah.
And to be, I'm afraid that in this social media internet age, we're a little too aware of our audiences. And what I treasure about what I do for a living is being alone in my study. And I am not, I'm often asked, for whom do I write? Well, of course, it sounds vain and even delusional to say for myself. But ultimately, of course, any artist worth his or her salt is writing for the fun of it, to make something that means something to them and not to other people. It's not about other people. And the other thing that dismays me is just, why do we read? Not just why do we write, why do we read? And I don't understand people who read in order to have their political viewpoints reaffirmed. I can understand why you would read an op-ed or a column that reinforces your views, which I'm afraid in nonfiction is all we ever do. Discouraging for a columnist. But I don't understand going to art for that. And I don't understand either why you would want to read a novel just because it is a display of virtue. In fact, my instincts are completely the opposite. I like mischief. I like humor. I like people who are being a little outrageous. I like transgression, and that used to be one of the main roles that art played, was to cheat, to break the rules, to, I guess I'm betraying partly the fact that I'm a late child of the 60s, and we like being bad. We were, I mean, yeah, there were some people were out there marching for environmentalism and everything, and that was our tedious side. Our fun side was taking drugs and having a lot of sex and saying outrageous things and using bad words in at a time that it still meant something to use bad words. It was still fun. And that's the world I grew up in. I have never entirely left it.
Yeah.
And so I'm just a little mystified.
Yeah.
I confess, by the a couple generations behind me, that are so prissy and involved in goodness. I mean, get a life, read some books that don't have to do with racial and gender justice.
Yeah.
And I in terms of taking on my own material, I don't like having it dictated to me.
Yeah.
That first off, these are the issues that really matter. And I think that we lose a sense, we get so focused narrowly on race and gender politics right now that we think that is all of politics. Right? So, and we think, therefore, that is all of morality.
Yeah.
And we lose a sense that what we're really incessantly focusing on is human hierarchy. Okay? So that's all we care about. And that's all we discuss, and that's all that seems to matter. But it's a big world out there, So that's a way of wearing blinkers.
Yeah.
And as a writer, I can see how easy it is to get trapped into thinking that that's all there is to write about.
Absolutely. And I think your mention of the 60s is really apposite here, because it strikes me that one of the most shocking things or disturbing things about the new kind of warriors for moral virtue, who are constantly trying to impose these political diktats on the creators of art and culture, is that they are actually reminiscent of the activity of what used to be conservatives and stuffy conservatives and hardcore religious people. If you think from, the controversy over Ulysses in the 1920s through to the banning of the gay fantasy poem about Jesus Christ, The Love That Dare Not Speak Its Name, which was subject of a blasphemy trial in Britain in the late 1970s. Through that period of the 20th century, and the kind of thing that the 60s radicals and counterculturalists were reacting against, was a moral virtue imposed on art, especially on transgressive art, by a conservative, blue-rinsed religious sections of society. And one of the things I find quite shocking is that among these young people who perceive of themselves as progressive and radical, and perceive of themselves as very daring, and actually perceive of themselves as transgressive, funnily enough, they are rehabilitating that old stuffy view in new language, I think.
Yeah, I've written about this.
Right.
I mean, there has been a weird inversion during my lifetime. But I do have to break it to the social justice warriors. They're the ones who are a big drag, okay? This prissiness that I talked about.
Yeah.
It goes back to the 1950s, into which I was born. And, there have always been people out there trying to control you and tell you what you could and couldn't do. And they have a very rigid version of the world, and they want to impose it on you, and you're not given the option to opt out. And it's always been the job of the freer, the more radical, the questioning, to break free of that. And now it's the young people who are taking on the old fogey role. And I find myself in this weird position at the age of 61, being out in the forefront still, I should be out of date, right? I should be behind. And instead I find that progress has gone so backwards, that I am, out with a few people, also old crusties, trying to preserve freedom of speech, and it shouldn't be my job anymore.
Yeah, absolutely. But one of the most insidious identitarian ideas, I think, is cultural appropriation, which I know you've written about, which is this is the idea that it is wrong for someone in one culture, particularly the dominant culture, as it's always referred to borrow ideas from or practices from another culture, or to depict another culture, or to assume that they have the right to inhabit the experiences of this other culture who they don't directly know or weren't brought up in, and so on. And it's reached utterly crazy levels in recent months. You know, Jamie Oliver has been taken to task.
It does nothing but get more absurd.
It gets more and more absurd as you go along. So he's taken to task for creating jerk chicken rice. Students' fancy dresses policed all the time. There's this bizarre online industry of policing white female celebrities' hairstyles, I've noticed. So if any of them have cornrows or dreadlocks, they will be instantly taken to task for cultural appropriation and crimes against black women's hair and so on. So it's reached utterly bizarre proportions. But it does have a very serious impact. And this is one of the things that you touched upon in your famous or infamous speech at the Brisbane Writers' Festival in 2016, where...
and it's only got worse since.
And it's got worse, because this is what I was going to ask you, because you made this fantastic point there where you say that the ultimate end point of this idea that you have to keep your hands off other people's experience is that there can be no fiction. You cannot make stories. You cannot write stories if you're not allowed to inhabit or think about or empathize with the experiences of others. And then in your speech, you said, I hope this is a passing fad. But clearly, it's not a passing fad.
It's definitely a fad.
Right.
Okay. It's just not passing.
Right.
Or not fast enough for me.
Right.
And I do think that when this era is over, and all eras are over eventually, that concept will be looked back on as one of the absurd excesses of the time.
And so do you still hold to your idea that you pushed in 2016, which is that it's so serious because, you know, we all laugh at the ridiculous examples of students being forbidden from wearing sombreros because that's to culturally appropriate Latin American experience. You know, that's all good fun and ridiculous and bizarre and scary. But you hold to the idea that this is it's a serious problem because in the level of literature in particular, it does actually send the signal that you should stay in your own lane, write about what you know and what you've experienced, which seems to me to really demean the whole purpose of literature, which is to broaden the horizon and to inhabit experiences beyond your own.
Yes, it's anti-fiction.
Right.
I mean, it the end point is everyone writes memoir, and that's it. Yeah. And my life is not very interesting, so I'm sorry to break it to you. I object to this concept on many levels. I would push back that your experiences does not necessarily only belong to you. Mm. That is, as we speak, you are part of my life, right? Mm. You're part of my day. You're part of my world now. What we say to each other is my experience. I experience you. And now you belong to me. Scary, isn't it? And I would extend that to, I walk out in the world. We're speaking in New York right now. There are many African Americans in my surround. They are part of my life. I say hello to them. They're part of the larger politics of this city. Belongs to me, right? Not just to African Americans. It belongs to me. Mm. African Americans in New York are part of my world too. So, and that extends to all ethnicities, anyone, and even people I read about. That's part of my life, right? I spent my time reading about these people, thinking about these people. And I should, by the way, because I should live in a large world that has many people in it, many of whom are different from me. And therefore, if I enter into an imaginary world, I'm going to people it from that experience. And so you can't lock your experience up and say it belongs to you. Not if because you are part of my world. In fact, in the great big giant sense, everyone on Earth is part of my world. They belong to me. And that it also extends to history, because I am a part of human history. And therefore, that history belongs to me. And I think that impulse to own all of it is healthy. And it leads to education and curiosity and inquiry and exploration. And this idea that, you live in a closet and, this is my broom.
Yeah.
This is not good. It's not going to make good art, but it's also not going to make good life. My other objection is to the commodification of experience. And I think that's, especially in literature, that's what's behind it.
Yes.
Certain minorities have got it into their head, because that's what this concept encourages, is that they own their experience and they can sell it. And therefore, if they corner the market, if they restrict supply, just in economic terms, then the price is going to go up.
Right.
So, if those white writers can't write about Asians or blacks or Native Americans or whatever, then people who belong to these groups will make more money. Actually, I think that's not really the way publishing works. And to the contrary, I think what you're going to see is a lot of mainstream literature becomes extremely cautious.
Yeah.
And ironically starts excluding the very groups who believe, that they want to be more represented in literature. I mean, it's just completely perverse. I mean, I'll give you an example. I recently published a collection of 2 novellas and 10 short stories called Property. Now, there's one short story in there that has a black character in it. It's not even a main character. Now, you know what? If I'm going to step back and criticize that collection, it's probably a little too white, right? That's where I'd criticize it. But no, I have had countless reviews zero in on this one short story that has, I mean, it's not quite a walk-on character, but it's definitely a secondary character. And I swear every single line that pertains to that character has been gone over for sins.
Yeah. Yeah.
And she speaks in a light black vernacular. What I now gather is called AAVE. African American Vernacular English.
Right.
Okay. And I've also read that I'm not supposed to be able to write that anymore. Now, by the way, that would make the likes of The Wire, Homicide on the Street, Clockers, really great stuff. Out. No, can't do that. David Simon, no, can only write about white people. And that, to me, I rest my case, because that stuff is great. But it was really sobering to discover. I mean, part of it is because of my reputation, and so, for being a sinner, I think, that it's been examined so closely. But it was creepy. It's been creepy. Well, and if I'm not careful, that kind of having it backfire, or at least having it, it's going to draw attention to this character. What if I write something that's going to be perceived as stereotyped or somehow not right? That discourages me from writing characters of different races. It does, and even me. Yeah. And that's how I realize how bad it's getting. This is not a small issue. Yes,
I was going to ask you exactly that question, which is what you think are the consequences of this kind of political, cultural climate. Because, I mean, if you think historically about the consequences, if this had existed in the past, hardly any of the great pieces of literature would have been written, or maybe not published. Men writing female characters, rich people writing about poor people, all sorts of literature would be seen as cultural appropriation, or
all of Dickens is poverty porn.
Poverty porn, exactly. All of that would have been, there would have been a million think pieces saying, don't let Dickens write again. But in terms of the consequences, because there is, I've noticed, in response to people like you and others who raise concerns about this culture, there will often be the pushback, well, it's not as bad as you're making out. There's no law against this stuff. We're just saying, please don't do it. But I think that really underestimates the potential for self-censorship and a kind of censorship that we might not necessarily see or even hear about because it takes place pre-publication. Do you think that kind of thing is happening?
I think the censorship is certainly happening drastically on an individual level, that people feel constrained about what kind of topics they can take on, what kind of characters they can use in fiction. And I also think that it's taking place in non-public, usually non-public publishing level. That is in relation to editors, what they choose to publish.
Yeah.
Right. So there's no record of that. You're never going to find out why certain works have been rejected. And then there are a few little public signs of what's I think is going on a massive level behind closed doors, like that poem in The Nation that I wrote about in my column about 6 weeks ago. It was a perfectly harmless poem, but it used a little bit of AAVE, and it was a white writer, and it was a little microcosm of what happened to that short story. Every single line gone over and picked out.
Yeah.
This time, instead of not just choosing not to publish it, they did publish it and then kind of unpublished it. Right?
Yeah.
They actually left it online, which I suppose is astonishing.
Yeah.
But the apology for publishing this little poem was far longer than the poem.
Yes.
and really nauseating.
Yeah.
And I felt that was an example of editors who are making many, the kind of editor that they're making many decisions every day in accordance with the same sentiments.
Yeah.
And you don't know about it.
Yeah.
So there are all kinds of other poems or short stories or articles or everything that are getting rejected because they don't fit the template.
Yeah.
And others are being changed to fit the template. And it's on the self-censorship level, all I know to do is to push back as publicly as I can and take the flag. And also try to push back in the confines of my study, because I start recognizing this encroaching cowardice. And I resent the imposition that I feel from myself as much as, or more, than I resent external imposition. And therefore, there are a couple chapters in my new book that are going to get me into trouble.
I'm glad to hear it. You're listening to The Brendan O'Neill Show. It would be great if you could give us a rating and maybe even a review. That is a really good way to help new listeners discover the show. But it's that process that you describe where it's almost like people have a Stasi in their own head. Kind of, so it's no longer the Stasi in your attic putting cameras or recording devices and making sure that the artist or the playwright or whoever it is not saying things that they shouldn't be saying. But instead, you install one of your own, and the danger, I think, and I mean, if even you have kind of had a feeling of this at times, you can imagine what other writers who might not be as brave as you are have an incredibly strong sense of pressure that there are certain things they shouldn't say and certain things they shouldn't depict. I thought the Nation and its apology for that poem, I thought, and your column about it was a brilliant example of the kind of climate we're talking about, and it made me think of 100 years ago or so, George Bernard Shaw wrote an apology after one of his plays came in for flack for its depiction of women riding bicycles and smoking and being quite modern. But his apology, of course, was ironic,
right?
And it is actually one of the great defenses of artistic freedom and freedom of speech. And he has that great point where he says, all great truths begin as blasphemies, and if you crush blasphemy, you crush the discovery of truth. And so you have this over a period of 100 years where writers or publishers in the past would have published an ironic apology as a kind of two-fingered salute to those who wanted to shut them up. Now you have a progressive magazine like The Nation publishing a deadly serious apology for a poem. And so I think that does capture
and
the climate you're talking about.
What made that story particularly grotesque was that the poet apologized as well.
Mm-hmm.
And the apology did sound right out of re-education camp.
Yes.
And this is one of those stories that might have redounded more to his benefit because it ended up getting a lot of press if he had stuck up for himself.
Yeah.
As it is, I'm not sure he's going to be getting a book contract out of that story.
Yeah. I mean, it's a genuinely tragic incident in literary history, I think.
But the kind of pressures to conform to a narrow set of views don't only pertain to artists.
Yeah.
And I think that's important to say.
Yeah.
Because we're living in a time that everybody is starting to feel very self-conscious about what they can and cannot say, and to get anxious even at their own dinner parties.
Yeah.
The column that I shouldn't write and probably will this weekend is going to deal with transgenderism. You notice I start to stutter as soon as
I have a question on transgenderism coming up.
Like my mouth seizes up. I'm not only interested in the story that I'm going to peg it on, but on in the broader situation whereby there are only certain things, there are only certain views about this that are acceptable, and this is not just a constraint that pertains to journalists. It pertains to everybody. Yeah. And what horrifies me is how rapidly the entire society embraced or seemed to embrace an enthusiasm for this movement, and only certain things are permissible to say, and that's all that gets said. I mean, it's just you can't question it at all. Yeah. It's just the most wonderful thing that's ever happened, and there should be more of it. Yeah. And that's it. That's and I've had numerous conversations with people, just regular people, not necessarily other writers, and if they talk about the whole issue of transgenderism, they'll lower their voice. They'll look around them to see if anybody is listening. And they'll often even say something about, well, this is off the record. Or, it's as if we're in Germany in 1939 and my friend wants to say something a little bit negative about Hitler. I mean, it's surreal. It is how frightened people are of saying anything remotely negative about what is really transforming a lot of people's lives. Now, whether that's for the better or for worse, that's what we can't talk about. Yes. And I'm just astonished by the successful utter stifling of debate about what is happening to children. And at least we should be able to talk about it. I mean, maybe it is great that now you don't have to decide because you were born a girl that you have to stay one. Maybe everyone should get to choose. It's going to be extremely expensive. But let's talk about it first. And we have signally skipped this conversation. And anybody who tries to conduct it, who pushes back a tiny bit, is totally denounced and jumped on. That's why I shouldn't write the column. That's why you should write it, because my view is that if you are not allowed to speak about something in the way that you describe, and I think that's exactly right, the way you describe it, that suggests it's probably something people should speak about. I come from a Catholic background years and years and years and years ago, and to me it reminds me of, it's like if you deny that a man can become a woman now, it's similar to if you denied when you were a Catholic that the bread in church becomes the body of Christ. So transgenderism is now the same as transubstantiation in terms of what you're allowed to say and what you're not allowed to say. And there is that kind of religious ethos around it. I have a question on transgenderism that I want to come on to in a second, but I completely agree with a comment you've made about how this is not just something that impacts on writers and artists, but it is a culture now that is felt by
almost everyone, and people I think imbibe it and take it on board and either speak quietly or just hold back certain opinions, and that's the kind of culture I think we increasingly live in. And I thought that your point you made about how you feel that you own all of human experience because you've encountered it, you live among it, and I was just thinking that in the past that would have been considered a very progressive humanistic view of life. What we have now, I think, and I think
now I'm a colonialist.
Now you're a colonialist, you're a neo-imperialist, you're a cultural imperialist, and you're a racist. This is the term that gets attached to people all the time.
You know, I've stopped reacting to that term.
Yes, I think that's wise. But it strikes me, and this is it taps into something that you've written about quite a lot. It strikes me that this is the politics of identity has had this incredibly divisive impact, and has had the impact of undermining what would have traditionally been considered good, liberal, progressive views. So you did a column recently where you said, you know, it used to be cool to have a so what attitude to people's skin color. That was the right approach. That was the good approach. That was the moral approach. You would be
I
so
was
what.
saying that's the desired endpoint.
That's the desired endpoint.
As far as I'm concerned,
yes.
Is that is not what is important to us about each other.
Yes.
And I don't understand going in the opposite direction. And by the way, I've argued the same thing in relation to gender.
Yes.
I'm not interested in. Well, I'm just not interested in being female. Frankly, it bores me. I didn't choose it. It has a lot of disadvantages. Most of them are physical.
Right.
A few of them are social. I'd like the social stuff to go away.
Right.
Okay. But that's kind of the end. I don't care about being female, and I don't like being forced to care. Like that. Yeah. It's not. I refuse to make it one of the primary aspects of my identity.
Yeah.
And the whole movement is in the opposite direction. Yes. That now we're supposed to fix ourselves on this strict continuum of gender identity, which I have also written about is completely dependent on stereotypes.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right. And actually, that's one of my primary objections to this embrace of the transgender movement, because when people's, if a man transitioning into a woman tells me that he feels like a woman, I don't know what he's talking about.
Mm. But it's really striking, because what I think we seem to be living through at the moment is the rehabilitation of the racial imagination. So the thing that we thought had been defeated, particularly in the post-war era, when it really became unsustainable to hold on to those early 20th century racial ideas, we thought we had done away with the racial imagination, but now it's coming back through the politics of identity, which encourages us almost to be myopically racial in how we approach people, and to engage with people depending on their background and their skin color, and to think about that all the time. And we're also witnessing the rehabilitation of gender stereotypes, particularly, as you say, through the transgender ideology, which seems to me to be based entirely on the view that womanhood is this almost like a pose that you can adopt, or a character that you can embrace,
or is an essence.
Yes,
to me it's worse than that.
Yeah.
I mean, to me it is a pose, right? It is a set of prescribed behaviors, and it is. Our concepts of femininity are all stupidly tied up with dresses and high heels and makeup, a lot of which I basically never wear. To me, essence transcends gender.
Yes.
So one's sense of self should be more profound than that. And I don't think that being female is meaningful enough to be an identity. It encompasses such an enormous range of being that it's meaningless.
Yeah.
And so that's what I mean when I don't understand when somebody says he feels like a woman.
Yeah.
I just don't get it. I don't feel like a woman.
Yeah.
In my deepest, most profound sense.
Yeah.
I think that if I woke up, miraculously in some sci-fi story and tomorrow I was male, it would be surprising, and it would take me a little while to get used to the new equipment. But I could get my head around it.
it's like we spend.
It would be fun and interesting.
It would be fun. It would be fun and interesting for a while. Then it would probably
and then the novelty would
be
wear
normal.
off.
Yeah, it's like we spend decades and decades trying to escape from biological or cultural boxes that people were constantly trying to force us into. You're a black person, you're a white man, you're a female, this is what you are, this is your biological inheritance, this is your cultural inheritance, it determines to a large extent what kind of person you will be, what kind of character traits you will have. Humanity, well, the progressive wing of humanity spends a long time pushing back against that, as summed up by the great line, let's judge people by the content of their character rather than by the color of their skin, which you could extend to rather than by their genitalia or anything else. So now we're pushing back on that. So another example, I think, of the kind of weird flip reversal that's happened that you spoke about earlier, where the so-called social justice warriors are actually rehabilitating some very backward, small c conservative, quite dangerous ideas, can also be seen in this embrace of a kind of essence-based, quite restrictive identity. So how has that come about? Is it a failure of universalism? Is it a failure of the left? Is it a collapse of those progressive projects, which then creates the space for this? How does that kind of thing manifest itself in what is otherwise a pretty modern, hip century?
I'm a little mystified.
Right. Me too.
I don't know how this happened. It's almost as if the left went far enough left that you couldn't go farther anymore, and then you just go around in a circle and end up on the right. I cannot illuminate you.
Right.
How this happened, except that the weird thing about being young is that you haven't been here before.
Yeah.
And so history's abstract, the present is immediate. I think a lot of these people are ahistorical.
Yeah.
I do feel that when you call millennials Soviet, it doesn't make any impact because they didn't grow up with the Soviet Union. They don't know what you're talking about.
They sometimes struggle, I think, to make connections between what they do and what other, obviously nastier people do. So, Saudi Arabia is looking into criminalizing certain forms of satire online, particularly if it ridicules religious beliefs and so on. And there's a bit of anger about that in the West. And you want to grab these people by the scruff of the neck and say, well, you guys have spent the past few years trying to criminalize Islamophobia, which includes criticism of religion as well as discrimination against Muslims, which we can agree is a bad thing. So I think, as well as
that's actually what I've used as an example in one of my columns. Sorry to keep referring to those.
Yes, please.
But I do write about what I care about. I'm fiercely secular, and despite having, or perhaps because of having a very religious upbringing, it didn't work with me at all by the age of about 8.
Yeah.
So I am critical of religions and generally feel that, on balance, they have had a negative effect historically. Now, that's just my viewpoint. And I would extend that criticism to all religions, perhaps not equally because they vary in the degree to which they ruin people's lives. I don't think Buddhism is as big an imposition as Islam, for example.
Yeah.
And I don't want it to be, I don't want what I just said to be regarded as hate speech.
Yes.
Now, the larger point of that column was what's especially ignorant about the identity politics movement is that in their policing of what you can and cannot say, especially cannot, there is this blithe assumption that the ability to shut people up, that they are embodying and embracing and promoting, is never going to pertain to them, right? They're always going to be the ones in control telling other people what to say and do. And they don't understand that once you privilege something like the concept of hate speech, which I find very dangerous.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, the United States has not embraced it, and the UK is embracing it. And it's death, because hate speech is in the eye of the ear of the beholder.
Yeah.
I think it's naive in the extreme to imagine that these kind of controls that you're imposing are never going to be imposed on you. And so If you are, for example, fiercely secular, and you want to be able to criticize religions in general as having had if not a negative effect historically, at least a bad effect on what it's like to be alive. My view is it's hard enough. Don't impose all that joylessness en masse on people.
Yeah.
If you want to be able to say that, then you have to preserve the larger political and cultural environment in which it is possible to say negative things about religions or anything else. And, I'd be the first to confess that, right, if you do have free speech, then people are often going to say atrocious things. That's one of the things that you allow. And to me, it's worth the price. Because most of the atrocious things that people say, first off, sound atrocious. So you're just letting people identify themselves as assholes. Right? So let them. I'd rather know.
Yeah.
Okay? And for the most part, we're also talking about people just saying stuff. And it doesn't have any palpable effect aside from, that was unpleasant or that offends me. And, we act as if offense it's almost as if someone bashed your head in.
Yeah.
No, I get offended by stuff all the time. You should see me over the newspaper.
Yeah. It's this new idea that words wound and that they have this incredibly... now, in fact, words can wound, intellectually speaking, and that's often what they're designed to do.
And that's the world we live in.
And that's the world we live in. But there's this conflation of words and violence, which I find incredibly worrying. And the thing that I find very worrying about hate speech, and you're absolutely right that it's been embraced in Britain, the idea of it, and across Europe, there are increasing laws in pretty much every European country against certain forms of hate speech, whether it's misogyny or against certain religions and so on. And what that actually does is it actually, in my view, it green lights hatred, because what you're saying is that these views over here held by these people, whether they are against Islam or they think women shouldn't be equal or whatever it might be, are so bad and so awful and so unspeakable that they can be punished in a court of law. And what you do is you push these people out for exposure and ridicule and hatred. So it actually creates tension rather than withdrawing it from society, and creates this kind of attempt on the part of people to criminalize more and more forms of speech that they find offensive.
Well, what is ultimately being criminalized is the views themselves and the feelings themselves.
Yeah.
You're criminalizing hatred.
Yeah.
You're criminalizing racism. Those are interior states that we're relying upon ourselves to judge from the outside. And, let he who is not a little bit of a racist cast the first stone.
Yeah. I
mean, I think we all suffer from preconceptions about each other. Some of them are positive. Asians are good at math, that kind of stuff. Blacks are good at basketball.
Yeah.
Those are racist views, right? None of us is perfect. One of the reasons this is an issue is that we have a problem with it, but criminalizing it is not the answer.
Yeah. And I think you're absolutely right that what it does is not only does it criminalize the expression of certain beliefs or emotions, but it also polices internal life, because there's this new attempt in Britain, for example, to increase the sentences that people will receive if the crime they commit was motivated by misogyny. So, for example, if they take photographs of a woman without her permission, or if they touch a woman in the street.
Well, this is the whole concept of hate crime.
Yeah.
And the United States does have hate crime, and I have written against that. Again, hate crime is about demonizing and criminalizing an internal state that you have to impute.
Absolutely.
And I'm very suspicious of this.
Absolutely. And the terrible, firstly, you have to impute it and you have to read it into people. Then the terrible consequences of it is that people are being punished and possibly imprisoned in some instances in Europe, not only for what they do, which is sometimes entirely justifiable. If they punch you in the face, they should be punished for that, but also for what they were thinking while they did it.
Yes.
So if they punch you in the face because you're a woman, that's worse, apparently, than if they punch you in the face just because you're Lionel Shriver.
Right.
And so what's happening there, no one should punch you in the face, of course, but what's happening there is that they are being punished for their ideology or their thought system or however
it
what
is about the policing of the mind.
Yeah. So on that question of misogyny and so on, I want to, and you've already touched on this because I did want to talk
I do want to say one thing, though.
Yes, please do.
And that is, I think we're losing sight of the fact that it is not against the law, nor should it be against the law, to be a misogynist, to be a racist or a xenophobe. You should be able to hate whomever you like. I know it's not pleasant.
Yeah.
Right? Even if, or to hate racists and to hate misogynists. I mean, that's your right. And it is your right to hold completely goofy views.
Yeah.
Goofy or stupid or amoral views or unmoral views. It's not against the law, and it has to stay not against the law.
I absolutely agree. The idea of policing and punishing what people feel or think is absolutely terrifying, even if it is hateful.
I just think we're losing sight of that.
Yeah. You're listening to The Brendan O'Neill Show. If you like this podcast and Spike's other podcasts, and also the articles and essays that Spiked publishes every day, please think about giving us a donation. Spike's content is free, and we want to keep it free, and donations really help us to do that. Head over to Spike's donation page now at www.spiked-online.com. I wanted to touch on the issue of feminism a little bit more before we run out of time, because you mentioned earlier how being a woman is not an interesting identity to you, or certainly not something that you do not define your identity through the fact
I've
that
stopped
you're a
fighting
woman.
it.
But in relation to feminism, and I also want to touch on the Me Too movement as well, because you've been critical of them. There is a handful of women, quite bravely in my view, who have criticised the Me Too movement for not only its criminalisation of men's sometimes clumsy come-ons, but also for the image it gives of women as these kind of wilting wallflowers who can't cope with, as you described it, the complicated dance of courtship. So just in relation to the points you've made about female identity, and it's not something that particularly interests you, and also the criticisms you've made of Me Too, do you think feminism has lost its way or gone down the wrong road, or do you think it's now an exhausted movement that's kind of beyond its sell-by date?
Of course, all movements suffer from success. To a remarkable degree, feminism has succeeded, and that's to be celebrated. And even, the Me Too movement, I pushed back against it a little because I thought it needed it. There were instances where people were calling out men who'd been getting away with, metaphorically, with murder, and they deserved it. So my big objection to the movement was that it rapidly led to a kind of leveling whereby all crimes were the same, all equally bad, and I reject that on a kind of jurisprudential level. It's like everybody gets a life sentence, even though you stole a roll of lifesavers. It did tend to go too far and started enticing anyone with a grudge. So I stopped believing the stories after a while, which was ironic, considering that it was all about getting people to believe people's stories. But the more and more credence we gave to people whose stories started to kind of stink, like that Ansar Aziz story. I mean, I gather he's finally re-emerging from the shadows and starting to do comedy again, but he didn't do anything.
No.
All he did was have a kind of crap date.
Yeah, bad dating.
Yeah.
But I think you're right, because what happened was there was a conflation between what sounded like actual crimes, harassment, abuse, rape in some instances, with other examples of just bad sexual etiquette.
Yes.
And so it became, there was a danger of it becoming a movement that was conflating too many things, but also took on an almost Victorian feel to it, where it was about judging men for dating behavior.
Very prim and anti-male.
Yeah.
In a way that I could see was backfiring big time with men, even though they were keeping their mouths shut.
Yes.
If I were a young man, it would have discouraged me from dating anybody. I would have stayed home with my computer porn.
Yes. I'm glad you said that, because I was going to raise one of the lines you used in one of your criticisms of Me Too was that imagine the impact this will have on men if we create a climate where they don't know if they can look at a woman or ask her if she wants a drink,
and you can't say you like her dress anymore.
You can't say you like her dress. There's so many things you can't do, or they feel that they can't do. I'm sure many women would actually welcome it, but men, I think, might freeze up. And you had that line that they would stay in their bedroom and watch their porn. And I do think there is one of the great ironies.
They're already inclined to do that anyway. They don't mean to be encouraged.
So any more encouragement is going to make it worse. But I do think one of the great ironies of modern feminism, it is contributed to such a stifling, sometimes depressing culture around sex and sexual engagement that actually it's inflaming, I think, the porn problem by pushing people off to seek their sexual gratification on their own, because the world of the complicated courtship is apparently too dangerous and full of minefields. So I think feminism is actually creating a trap for itself on this issue.
Yeah, and there's an atmosphere coming off the movement that is anti-sex, that views all sex as an assault. There's no sense that women actually enjoy being touched and want to be courted and want to be desired. You know, there's been a demonization of all male desire, and therefore the desire itself is a kind of assault. Now, hey, call me old-fashioned. I like being desired, right? It turns me on. It's great. Yeah. And I love being touched by someone whom I love. Yeah. Okay? Yeah. So this is alien to me. Yeah. And it does feel prudish. It feels like what my generation thought we overthrew. Yeah. And it does seem to deny women agency. And there are a lot of the stories in the Me Too thing that is kind of like, well, okay, I agree that you shouldn't have ever been put in a position where you are trading sexual favors for career advancement, but take a little responsibility. If you did trade sexual favors for career advancement, that's a form of prostitution. So you participated in that marketplace. So I'm sorry you were put in that position and you shouldn't have been, but take a little bit of ownership of you accepted the deal. Yeah. And instead we're supposed to see women in these positions as perfectly helpless. Yeah. And less capable than men of dealing with a situation in which everyone's drunk and everyone's fumbling and so on. That's the logical conclusion of this stuff. Yes, or the illogical conclusion is the men start playing the same game, which is what's happened with the Asia Argento case. Yeah. You know? That's right. That kid who's now going after her for seducing him at the age of 17. And, you know, I know it's completely sexist of me, but somehow I have a hard time imagining that this 17-year-old boy and a very attractive older woman seducing him, that was a terrible trauma from which he has never recovered. Yeah. I'm sorry. No, I completely and utterly agree with that. I'm so skeptical. Okay, so my last question then for you is, so from what you've been saying, it seems clear to me that you are in favor of sexual desire and sexual liberation. You're in favor of freedom of speech. You are in favor of racial equality or colorblindness, and you're in favor of culture and literature that is transgressive and daring and experimental and winds people up. Those to me seem to me to be pretty good 60s style countercultural radical values. And yet they are increasingly depicted as problematic and conservative. Right-wing. Which is bizarre. It's completely bizarre. And so my question for you then is, how can we defend these values, which I think are pretty good values, and encourage other people to do likewise? I'm doing what I can, and I can assure you that there are lots of other people like me out there. They're not necessarily writing for the New York Times, or there are a lot of people in my generation anyway who broadly share my values. I think what is important though is not people my age. It's a generation, 2 generations behind me And that's where I think a site like Spiked Online is very valuable.
Lionel Shriver, thank you very much.
My pleasure.
Thank you for listening to The Brendan O'Neill Show. We'll be back next month with another guest and more discussion. Don't forget to subscribe. See you next month. And in the meantime, keep reading Spiked at www.spiked-online.com.